Welcome. This is the American Presidency class. In today's lectures, we will talk about the presidential selection process in two parts. During this first part, we will talk about presidential selection from a historical perspective, and also we'll talk about how it has changed through time. In the second part, we will talk about the reforms to the selection process that occurred after the 1968 election, taking effect in 1972. So without further discussion, let me share the screen with my computer. And we'll get going here. Okay, as the slide says, this is presidential selection part one. So initially what we want to talk about is the historical evolution of the selection process. We've done some of this already in the sense that we talked about flaws in the selection process that were made by the founding fathers. They didn't think it fully through. And as a result, we ended up with a system that didn't account for political parties and also an electoral college system that can result in the winner not being the winner of the popular vote or even the plurality of the popular vote. So the founders struggled for a long time to devise a way to select the president and the vice president. Various methods for selecting the executive were offered at the convention, and most of them were reviewed and discarded during the Constitutional Convention. The one that was accepted is the one that we are currently under. But at the convention, they talked about selection by the legislature, selection by direct popular democracy, let the governors of the states select the president, let an electoral college select the president, and then finally a lottery could be used to select the president. A decision resulted only very late in the convention when the Committee of Detail presented executive election by special electors selected by the state legislatures. This compromise preserved states' rights, provided benefits to slave states, increased the independence of the executive branch, and avoided direct popular election. So they deliberated a long time, and they finally settled on the electoral college. We've talked earlier in our discussions about what happened there, and the big state, small state controversy, north-south controversy over the value of slaves, and so forth. So we won't double down on that. While members of Congress are expressly forbidden from being electors, the Constitution requires that the House and Senate count the Electoral College's ballots, and in the event of a tie, to select the president and vice president respectively. Actually, it's the House that selects the president and vice president in case of a tie. The 1800 presidential election initially tested the presidential selection system when Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, the Democratic Republican candidates for president and vice president, tied at 73 electoral ballots each. The House, under the Constitution, then chose between Jefferson and Burr for president. We talked some about this earlier. Note that the Constitution mandates that House members vote as a state delegation and that the winner must obtain a simple majority of the states. So it's not electors based on population. Rather, each state gets one vote in the House concerning who will be selected president in case of a tie. The House deadlocked at 8 states for Jefferson, 6 for Burr, and 2 tied. And so no candidate had a majority of the votes. 8 for Jefferson was a plurality, but not a full majority. While the Democratic Republicans had intended that Jefferson be president, the Federalists still controlled the House until the new government assumed power. And they launched an effort to make Burr the president. After 6 days of debate and 36 ballots, Jefferson finally won 10 state delegations in the House when the Burr supporters in the two tied states, Vermont and Maryland, filed blank ballots. And remember from earlier, we talked about how the governors in a couple of the states had threatened to mobilize the state militias and to march on New York in order to settle the controversy, to force Congress into a settlement. That didn't happen because on the 36th ballot, Jefferson was awarded the presidency. The 12th Amendment was ratified after this debacle to prevent a recurrence, prevent it from happening again. Since the 12th Amendment, two other presidential elections have come to the House. In 1824, Andrew Jackson of Tennessee won a plurality of the national popular vote and 99 votes in the Electoral College, 32 short of a full majority. John Quincy Adams was the runner-up with 85 electoral votes, and Treasury Secretary William Crawford had 41. Speaker of the House Henry Clay had 37 and expected to use his influence in the House to win election. But the 12th Amendment required the House to consider only the top 3 vote getters when no one commands an overall majority. The House, still controlled by the Democratic Republican Party, chose Adams over Jackson. And when Adams made Henry Clay, the Secretary of State, Jackson said the two had struck a corrupt bargain. Nevertheless, Adams became president for the next 4 years. Needless to say, the Jacksonians cried foul for the next 4 years. And so it was a problematic presidency for John Quincy Adams. In 1824, there was only one political party, the Democratic Republicans. By 1828, a two-party system had fully reemerged. The Jacksonians, later calling themselves the Democratic Party, the predecessor to the modern Democratic Party, and the anti-Jacksonians later became the Whig Party. The contested 1876 presidential election between Republican Rutherford B. Hayes of Ohio and Democrat Samuel J. Tilden of New York was the last to require congressional intervention. Tilden won the popular vote as well as the electoral count, but Republicans challenged the results in 3 southern states which submitted certificates of election for both candidates. While the Constitution requires the House and Senate to formally count the certificates of election in joint session, it is silent on what Congress should do to resolve disputes. In January 1877, Congress established a Federal Election Commission, no relation to the modern Federal Election Commission. This commission was to investigate the disputed Electoral College ballots. The bipartisan commission, which included representatives, senators, and Supreme Court justices, voted along party lines to award all the contested ballots to Hayes, securing the presidency for him by a single electoral vote. Okay, let's think about the Electoral College for a while. The Electoral College is an important strategic consideration for candidates who are seeking the presidency. Because of the Electoral College, representation-wise, each person's vote is more important in the smaller states. However, the winner-take-all rule in 48 of the 50 states means that there is an incentive for candidates to focus only on states they have a chance of winning or affecting. This also means that large populous states are more important to the election and receive more attention. Only in the first 2 elections, when Washington was a unanimous choice, did the electors exercise a nonpartisan and presumably independent judgment as was intended by the Founding Fathers. Within 10 years, the party system had developed and electors became its political captives. Nominated by the party, they were expected to vote for the party's candidates, and they did. In 1800, all of the electors voted for Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. As noted, the election was cast to the House of Representatives, which, after some skullduggery, as we noted, finally chose Jefferson, despite the fact that it was still controlled by the Federalist Party. Various non-decisive elections have occurred since then. as noted, Samuel Tilden received 253,000 more popular votes than his Republican rival, Rutherford B. Hayes. However, because of the disputed electoral votes in 3 states, the election was sent to the House, which was Republican, and Hayes became the president. In 1888, Grover Cleveland had 95,000 more popular votes than Republican Benjamin Harrison. However, Harrison had the majority of the electoral votes and became the president. The election of 2000 resulted in Al Gore receiving about 544,000 more popular votes than Bush. However, Bush received the most electoral votes after 5 justices of the Supreme Court gave him Florida's electoral vote by denying a recount in 3 heavily Democratic Florida counties. The election of 2016 resulted in Hillary Clinton receiving almost 3 million more votes than Donald J. Trump. Obviously, there have been legitimacy questions there. All total, there have been contested presidencies 9 times out of 8 times out of 45 elections. In other words, 1 out of every 9 presidential elections has been contested in terms of the winner received more electoral votes, but not more popular votes. There have also been 19 presidents who have received less than 50% of the popular vote. That is, they won a plurality of the votes because a third party was involved in the election. So there have been numerous times when presidents took office without having a plurality of the popular votes, although they did win the electoral votes generally. There were other close calls. For example, in the modern era, John Dewey in 1948, if he had carried California and he needed about 12,000 votes, would have become president over Truman. Kennedy in 1960 had 9,000 votes in Missouri and Illinois changed. Nixon would have been president. Nixon in 1968 with a change of 55,000 votes in 3 states. And then finally Carter in 1976, 10,000 votes in Hawaii and Ohio. And Gerald Ford would have become president. Here are some links that you can see the electoral and popular vote results through American history. We won't go there. Rather, I'll leave that to you to explore. Basically, the first link shows the result of presidential elections by popular vote margin, who got the most popular votes. And then the second link shows a list of states' presidential elections by electoral vote margin. So you can see there the difference between the two by combining them. Should we have an electoral college? We will have a debate about that rather than a popular vote. Obviously, there are consequences to the design chosen by the founding fathers. Political parties have ever been important in presidential elections. Certainly after 1800, political parties became exceedingly important. So we're going to talk about political parties now for a while. The Constitution did not provide for political parties or a party nominating system. It was just assumed that well-qualified people would run for office and be elected. The founders were especially suspicious of the ability of the people to select and elect a president. Citizens were generally illiterate during this time. They were not attuned to the sophistications required for making coherent policy choices. Communications was limited, and it was very difficult for candidates to launch a national campaign. More important, according to the founders, the people could not be trusted to select supportive officials for the propertied class. The people, particularly those who did not have property, were subject to bribery. Okay, so it is informative to look at the nature of presidential selection processes from a historical standpoint. And here's a bar graph. We're going to go to this one. It's a list of United States presidential election by popular vote margin, and it also gives you the elections where the winner won by electoral votes. Okay, so while we wait for this to go there, it did go there. We can go to this page. Let's expand it so we can look at it a little more carefully. And you can see that the House, marked by an H, decided the election of Jefferson, Adams, okay, there is an H elsewhere here. Let's see if we can find it. Okay, there should be an, okay, it's marked by a star here for Rutherford Hayes and Benjamin Harrison. And then up in modern times, George W. Bush and Trump. And also interesting to me anyway, and it should be interesting to you, is the amount of the popular vote achieved by particular political parties. Now at the bottom we have a label for each political party. For example, up front here we have the Federalist Party, and you can see that the Federalist Party, the only time the Federalist Party won a full majority of the popular vote was during the Washington administration. During the Adams administration, you can see that the 1796 election is won by the Federalist Party, but from there on out, you can see the Democratic Republican Party is very dominant, so that by John Quincy Adams, you only have a Federalist Party and a little small party here at the top, which is labeled Other. So everybody in the 1824 election was a Democratic Republican. And then from history on out, we can see the shifting tides of Democrats versus Republicans and third parties. For example, in the election of 1860, where Abraham Lincoln was elected, you can see the Democrats are here. You see that the Other party is here, and then Lincoln won the Republican Party vote, and then finally the yellow is the Whig Party, and these are the Whig Party voted for Lincoln, obviously. And by 1864, the Whig Party had gone out of existence, and they voted uniformly as Republicans. Okay, so from there on out, we see the balance between the two-party system. You can see that Wilson, the first Democratic president since Grover Cleveland, Wilson won because of the presence of a third party, and he actually won a second term during a time when there's a third party, so he didn't get a plurality of vote. Anytime the blue party or the red party doesn't cross the line, but they win the election, the president won by plurality instead of a majority. For example, Clinton in 1993, you can see that the presence of a third party, the party that was founded by Ross Perot, was important in that election, and also in the second election. George W. Bush won election only because of the presence of a third party. Obama won outright both times, and then Trump won because of the existence of a third party. In this case, probably the Green Party was important. So this little bar graph can tell us a lot about presidential elections and the partisan balance in the American system. I invite you to explore this bar graph on your own independently. Okay, in 1788 and 1792, there were no political parties, and Washington was assumed to be the first president. He won an overwhelming majority of the popular vote, although such votes were not formally recorded until 1824. In 1796, with the incumbent George Washington having refused a third term, Federalists in Congress selected incumbent Vice President John Adams from Massachusetts as their candidate for the presidency, with former Governor Thomas Pinckney of South Carolina as the next most popular Federalist. As a result of Washington having approved Hamilton's banking plan, Jefferson and Madison had begun organizing an opposition to the Federalist Party starting in 1791, 1793 electoral cycle. Unlike the previous election of Washington, where the outcome was a foregone conclusion, Democratic Republicans, the party initiated by Jefferson and Madison, campaigned heavily in 1796 for Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, and the Federalists campaigned heavily for Adams and Pinckney. The debate was very acrimonious, with Federalists trying to identify the Democratic Republicans with the violence and chaos of the French Revolution, and the Democratic Republicans accusing the Federalists of wanting monarchy and aristocracy. In foreign policy, the Democratic Republicans denounced the Federalists over the Jay Treaty, perceiving it as too favorable to Britain, while the French ambassador embarrassed the Democratic Republicans by publicly backing them and attacking the Federalists right before the election. Although Adams won the presidency, Thomas Jefferson received more electoral votes than the intended vice presidential candidate, Thomas Pinckney. So the executive was split, as we talked about earlier, with the Federalist John Adams elected president and the Democratic Republican Thomas Jefferson elected vice president. 4 years later, the congressional caucuses met again. Now note that the caucuses in the Federalist caucus in Congress had selected Adams and Pinckney as the Federalist candidate, and the opposing Democratic Republican Party, its caucus in Congress had chosen Jefferson and Burr. So 4 years later, in 1800, the caucuses met again for the purpose of recommending candidates. At the time, the newspapers reported this as undemocratic and called it King Caucus. King Caucus. And this mode of selecting the nominees for the two parties existed until 1828. Note that this mode of nominating presidential candidates, King Caucus, placed Congress in a preeminent position. This was not unlike parliamentary government today, where it is the parliament that chooses the chief of state, the head of state. And so this precedent that was established in the beginning, called King Caucus, the people deemed it as being undemocratic, and it lasted until 1828. Ratification of the 12th Amendment, as we talked about earlier, occurred in 1804. From that point forward, presidential elections were intrinsically partisan in nature and very quickly became winner-take-all contests. However, the Federalist Party declined quite rapidly after the War of 1812, when they strongly opposed the war, even threatening secession at the Hartford Convention of 1815. And I've got a hot link there to the Hartford Convention of 1815, where you can get some information on what the Federalist Party was all about during the War of 1812. They strongly opposed the war, as I note here, and they even threatened to secede from the Union at the Hartford Convention of 1815. So go to that hot link and explore that further. The War of 1812 was very unpopular in New England. The New England economy depended heavily on trade, and the British blockade during the War of 1812 threatened to destroy the northern economy entirely. In 1814, the British Navy managed to enforce their blockade on the New England coast, so that the Federalists of New England sent delegates to the Hartford Convention in December of 1814, and they recommended at that convention secession from the Union. After the British defeat at the Battle of New Orleans, though, under the leadership of Andrew Jackson, intense patriotism erupted all across America. In the North, in the South, in the West, Americans suddenly became very patriotic as the war appeared to be won by Andrew Jackson. As a result, Federalists lost the loyalty of many citizens. By 1816, the Federalist Party had ceased being a viable force in American politics. some of you may know that the British defeat at New Orleans actually occurred after the peace treaty favorable to America had been signed. The ensuing period of only one political party was called the Era of Good Feelings. I have a hot link there for you to explore the Era of Good Feelings. But the Era of Good Feelings lasted basically from the end of the War of 1812, from about 1816 through 1824. After the controversial 1824 election, there was a breakdown in the one-party system, with the remaining Democratic-Republican Party dividing into two factions. These were the National Republicans after 1824 and the Jacksonian Democrats after 1824. Again, you can go to the hot links that I've supplied there for further information on these. National Republicans supported John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay in 1828. Democrats supported Andrew Jackson and William Crawford in 1828. The formation of these political parties led to the demise of the Congressional Caucus, earlier we called it King Caucus, and to the development of a more decentralized mode of nomination that was increasingly consistent with the sectional composition of the political parties. By the 1830s, national nominating conventions became the main way for brokering interest and reuniting the party for a national election campaign. The first nominating convention occurred in 1831 by the Anti-Mason Party. It was a small but relatively active third party. Being a small party, it had no congressional members and therefore organized a general meeting in which delegates came from state parties who chose nominees, as well as determined the party's positions on important issues of the day. The hot link I've supplied there to the Anti-Mason Party, you'll basically, I invite you to visit that, but you'll basically learn that the Anti-Mason Party was, just as the name implies, against Masons, Freemasonry. And you may or may not know, and we'll talk about this later when we talk about personal characteristics of the presidents subsequently in the class. You may or may not know that many of our presidents have been Masons. And during this period of American history, prior to the 1830s, being a member of Freemasonry was almost a requisite for holding any public office in the United States. And so this party, the Anti-Mason Party, arose in reaction, in negative reaction to that development. The Jacksonian Democrats and National Republicans, the two parties that had formed after the 1824 election, followed suit in 1832 with the first national nominating convention by major parties. Afterward, national nominating conventions became the standard method for selecting nominees and for articulating party positions, that is, the party platforms. The modern Democratic Party traces its origins to 1828 and is the oldest of our modern political parties. Andrew Jackson is associated with Jacksonian democracy, but actually Martin Van Buren was largely responsible for the development of the Democratic Party and the organization of the party. National Republicans advocated federal money for internal development, government promotion of commercial interests through high tariffs and low taxes on the wealthy, and a strong national bank that would provide easy credit to business entrepreneurs. The Constitution was to be interpreted flexibly to allow these policies. Jacksonian Democrats advocated free markets, no federal money for internal development, tariffs and excise taxes that were only sufficient to fund the government, and were against a national bank. The Constitution was to be interpreted very strictly so that states' rights were protected, and it did not allow the policies advocated by national Republicans. After 1836, two major parties emerged, calling themselves Democrats, which we've already laid out what they believed in, and Whigs. A link there to the Whigs will tell you a lot more about the Whig Party. Essentially, they had similar views to the old Federalist Party. Whigs morphed from the National Republicans, the anti-Masons, and disaffected Democrats. They had similar views to the similar views to the Federalist Party. The modern Republican Party, and I have a hot link there for that, was born in 1854 when Whigs were split between those supporting and opposing the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which would have allowed slavery in the new Western territories based on popular referendum. They joined with abolitionist Democrats, mainly Northern Democrats, to form the modern Republican Party. Republicans were largely from the North and opposed the extension of slavery, while Southerners largely favored it. Republican Abraham Lincoln won the presidency in 1860 on an anti-slavery platform and support for increased federal promotion of business and commercial interests. Interestingly, early Republicans were supporters of commercial interests and wanted to use the power of the central government as a means for promoting economic expansion. They were not for free markets. And so original Republicans, those born in 1854, 1860, in that era, were unlike modern Republicans regarding the role of the central government. Modern Republicans prefer that the central government keep a hands-off approach to the economy and also relative to the states. You can see a timeline of the development of American political parties by clicking here, and we're going to do that. Okay, so the thing I would point out on this page is the division of the political parties into party systems. The first party system lasted from 1792, which is during the first Washington administration, to 1824, which was the election, which was the period prior to John Quincy Adams being elected. And it featured the Federalist Party and the Democratic Republican Party, and the two competing parties there were those two parties. The second party system, lasting from 1828 to 1854, followed the splintering of the Democratic Republican Party. You had the Whig Party, led by Henry Clay, that grew from the National Republican Party, and the Democratic Party of Andrew Jackson. So you had the Democrats and the Whigs. The third party system that lasted from 1854 to the 1890s featured the anti-slavery Republican Party, which had adopted many of the policies preferred by the Whigs, such as national banks, railroads, high tariffs, homesteads, and aid to land-grant colleges. The Democratic Party was in large part in opposition to this period. They were the opposition party. The fourth party system, lasting from 1896 through 1932, featured the Democratic Party versus the Republican Party, with the progressive era dominating in this period. And it was dominated by the Republican Party through this period. And then the fifth and sixth party systems, there is debate on whether there actually is a sixth party system. But the fifth party system would have us in a party system between Democrats and Republicans lasting from 1933 through present. The sixth party system viewpoint would have Democrats and Republicans in counterbalance to one another, with the division point being the Reagan administration and the moral majority and the Reagan coalition and its ideology that emerged following that. And so I invite you to just mention this and to study this in further detail than we've done here. Early nominating conventions were very informal and rowdy affairs. There was drinking, smoking, chewing tobacco, that sort of thing. Choosing the delegates to the nominating conventions was left to the state political parties, and more particularly to the leadership of the state political parties. There was nothing democratic about this. Public participation at either the state or national level was extremely low, extremely minimal. Candidates were selected by the state party officials for the public rather than by the public. And so what we have here is a system where elites at the state level are choosing delegates to the national conventions, who then in turn choose the candidates for the two political parties. Selection processes themselves then were not democratic, nor were those who were selected representative of the general population. They did serve the purpose of making governing easier. In other words, because candidates were selected for the public rather than by the public, there was a detachment between the candidates and the publics. And the representatives were detached, if you will, from the public because they had been placed in office by elites at the state and local level. 19th century conventions served a multiplicity of purposes. And we'll just kind of list these briefly here. They were a forum for party bosses to articulate what they wanted, their positions. They could reach agreements with other party bosses, and support would be mobilized for those conventions. By brokering interest, they helped to unite disparate elements within the party, converting an agglomeration of state party organizations into a national coalition for the purpose of electing a president and a vice president. And then finally, the nominating position buttressed the position of party officials, but at the expense of rank and file party members. The influence of leadership depended on the ability of party leaders to deliver the votes. To ensure loyalty, party leaders handpicked their delegations. Recall also that in the period between the Jackson administration and the Garfield administration was one dominated by patronage. And so patronage was a way for the two political parties to engender loyalty among their members. Demands for reform began in the Progressive Era at the start of the 20th century. A number of states changed their mode of delegate selection to allow greater public participation. So there's a thrust at the start of the 20th century to move away from the party boss system into a system where the public had a greater input as to who would be selected as the candidates for the political parties. This movement was short-lived. There was low voter turnout in primaries, which is what the manifestation was of this movement. Elections cost a lot to put on. Party leaders were opposed to the primaries. And so many state legislators made their primaries advisory only, and some disappeared altogether. Look at the dynamics of the following graphs. Okay, so what we have here is the number of primaries that were conducted by the two political parties by year. And you can see here that in 1908, there were party primaries in 12 Democratic states and 13 Republican states. By 1912, the Democrats and the Republicans were both conducting about 20 primaries. This declined quite sharply for the Democrats following this. Republicans stayed at 20 primaries into 1916. And then you can see that the number of primaries fell off quite significantly. And then you see ups and downs during this period. But what happens here? In 1968, you have a low number of states, about 17 states for each party conducting party primaries. But then in 1972, the number of primaries increases sharply, and it continues increasing sharply from there on out, so that by the latter part of the 20th century, we see a quite high number of primaries conducted in each of the states. Our graph only goes through 2008, but we're going to look later on at how states conduct their elections. So let's move on from that. The percent of delegates that were obtained from primaries tells a little bit different picture. And you can see that the Democrats, about 33%, 32% of delegates were chosen by primaries in 1912. This is when Woodrow Wilson was elected. And you can see that about 41% Republicans delegates were selected by primaries. That increased quite sharply for both Democrats and Republicans, much higher for Republicans than for Democrats, and then fell off during the 1920s and 1930s. And then again, by 1968, it's still fairly low, but then for both political parties, especially the Democratic Party, you see the number of primaries increase quite sharply between 68 and 72, and then continuing to increase. And so it has leveled off from there at a high level. So until the 1970s, the story these graphs tell is that primaries were not the main way in which candidates were selected. And indeed, presidential candidates avoided primaries until the 1970s. Primaries were seen as an all-lose situation. Again, the candidates were selected by party leaders and elites for the public, rather than through popular judgment. Candidates therefore had everything to lose by entering primaries. Occasionally, primaries were seen as a way to test one's political popularity. For example, Eisenhower entered a few primaries in 1952. Why did he want to test his political popularity? He was not a politician. Kennedy, who was a Catholic, in 1960 entered a few primaries, and he wanted to test his viability for the presidency in primaries because of his religion. Johnson was uncertain about his reelectability in 1968, and therefore he entered the New Hampshire primary and didn't do as well as he needed to do in the New Hampshire primary. He didn't lose, but he also didn't win overwhelmingly, as an incumbent president would be expected to do. And of course, he dropped out after 1968. In each case, what these candidates wanted to do was to prove to party leaders that they could win in the general election by winning first in primaries. So as we talked about with the graphs, conventions still settled the nomination process until about 1976. What happened to cause a change to a more democratic process? Well, the television age and higher visibility of political events had a profound effect on the image that selecting candidates for the public rather than by the public had. There was a growing sense that conventions were anti-democratic as a result of televised coverage of the conventions. New interest groups had arisen, pushing for attention and representation. For example, the Civil Rights Movement was occurring during this period. The anti-Vietnam War movement was occurring during this period, and gay rights were coming to prominence during this period as well. The image produced by the 1968 nominating convention in Chicago was very, very powerful on television. There were protests and police, with the police beating protesters. The police were dressed in riot gear, and they had invisible shields, the clear plastic shields, and they were pushing crowds back. Groups were locked out of the convention. And that's the image that you get on television in 1968. White Anglo-Saxon Protestant America was inside, nominating the president. Outside, you see a rainbow of colors and a rainbow of political preferences, whereas the uniform preferences on the inside of the 68 convention. Okay, we have reached the conclusion of our prepared slides for the first part of this lecture. during the second part, we will talk about the reforms to the selection process that have occurred since 1968. And so with that, I will leave you to have a good afternoon. I will do that myself, and I'll see you next time.